Chapter 15. After Ted was taken away, Mr. and Mrs. Bundy and I went directly to the airport. We had 3 hours to wait until the next flight to Seattle. I ended up in the airport bar where I drank and wrote Ted a tearful letter on the only paper I had, a savings passbook. The waitress asked me if I was okay. I didn't care what anybody thought. The people in the bar were talking about Ted's conviction. When the waitress came by again, I told her she was wrong. Ted wasn't guilty. And she shouldn't blow off her mouth when she didn't know what she was talking about. On the plane, I kept drinking. Mrs. Bundy came and sat with me for a little while. She told me a little about the man who had fathered Ted, but hadn't even stuck around until he was born. She told me about living in Philadelphia with her young child and the need to start a new life for herself and her son. She had moved to Tacoma and met Johnny Bundy. They had had a small wedding. Ted was 5 years old, and he had stuck his hand in the wedding cake. "That's why I never discussed it with him," she said. I thought he remembered. A few days after I returned to Seattle, I got a phone call from Don Hull, the probation officer who was writing the pre-sentence report on Ted. He wanted to know if I still thought Ted was guilty. Maybe it was just a matter of semantics, but I didn't think I had ever told anyone I thought Ted was guilty, not flatly. Hall read from Jerry Thompson's police report that I had said that Ted frequently roamed around the neighborhood late at night and had a bad habit of jumping out of hiding places to scare me. I couldn't believe the distortion of what I had said. I had told Thompson that Ted had hidden and scared me a few times in all the years I had known him, but I had never said he made a habit of it. When I wouldn't confirm Thompson's report, Hull said he had heard I'd had a change of heart. It was a terrible phone call, and if I'd had enough energy, I would have been furious, but the conversation only left me more depressed. When Ted called me a few days later, I told him about Hull's phone call, and he asked me to call Hull back and try to make sure he knew I didn't agree with Thompson's report. Ted said that his own talks with Hull had convinced him that there was no hope of a fair pre-sentencing report. I put off calling Don Hull back for a few days because I knew it would be bad, and it was. I dragged myself back to the same phone booth where many months ago I had called the police. As I sat there trying to figure out what I was going to say to Hull, I was overcome by anger. How many women died after I made those calls? If the police were so goddamn sure that Ted was guilty, shouldn't they be held accountable for the deaths that occurred after I called them in October 1974? Weren't they murderously irresponsible? I called Hull and told him I thought Thompson's report was slanted and full of inaccuracies. Hull dismissed this again, attributing it to my change of heart, and I hung up. The inconsistencies in my thinking bothered me. I am, I thought, capable of holding 100 different points of view on any one idea at any one time. There is no real me. That same day, I had my first visit with a counselor. That night I went home, got drunk, and wrote Hull a letter. Ted called me just after I finished it. When I read it to him, he said it was impressive and persuasive. Among other things I wrote, "You call it a change of heart, I call it putting my head on straight." Hull had been to see Ted a couple of times. He told Ted that he had spoken with Carol Durant and that she was 90% sure that Ted was the one. Ted was dumbfounded. A standard interpretation of beyond a reasonable doubt given by a judge to a jury is, if after a consideration of the evidence you are 95% sure that the defendant is guilty, you must acquit, he told me. There is a reasonable doubt. Not even Carol Durant could have found me guilty. I am not. Hull had asked Ted some questions about his old girlfriend, Angie. Furious that she would portray herself as having an intimate relationship with Ted, I called Angie and gave her hell. She was horrified that she had been identified as an ex-girlfriend. She told me that she had never talked with Hull, so I could only guess that the label had come from Thompson's report. Angie was so upset that she called me back the next morning and told me that if Hull did call her, she wouldn't speak to him. I sure missed Angie's friendship. My life had changed so much that I couldn't believe it was still my life. I was spending most of my waking hours sifting through the past, reliving my mistakes. Sometimes I would bury my face in the yellow turtleneck sweater of Ted's that I had retrieved from the back of the rental car in Salt Lake City. It smelled like a mixture of Tide and Right Guard, a distinctly good and Ted-like smell. I missed him more than I thought possible. The newspapers were full of stories about Patty Hearst. She and her SLA captors had been captured in September 1975, and now in March 1976, she was on trial for helping the SLA rob a bank. There was much discussion in the press about whether or not she had been brainwashed. She had been kidnapped and physically, mentally, and sexually abused, but some people didn't understand why that would cause her to join with her kidnappers. I thought of writing her a letter because I understood perfectly well what the power of fear could do to a person. On March 22nd, Ted appeared before Judge Hanson to be sentenced, but the judge ordered him to the Utah State Prison for a 90-day psychiatric evaluation. At first, Ted thought there was hope. He knew he was a normal, healthy young man, not a murderer or a kidnapper, and he knew this would come through in any fair evaluation. The day he appeared in court, I heard something on TV that made me fire off a furious letter to him. They always make me grit my teeth, but this one got me on my glass jaw. They went on and on about the court proceedings and then said the judge had ordered that Mrs. Bundy and Bundy's girlfriend be allowed to visit with you in private. Since I'm up here and Judge Hanson was down there, I surmise there must be two girlfriends. Good old Kim. What would we do without her? This was the 1,000,000,000th time I had felt this way about Ted and another woman. Ted was Ted. He would never change. I don't know what I expected him to do about anything, especially now, but I unloaded on him anyway. I discussed Ted and other women with my counselor at great length. If it hurts, he asked me, why do you put up with it? The answers were the same as they had always been. Because I love him and because I'm stupid. I discussed the guilt I felt about calling the police in the first place and the fears and doubts about Ted that had prompted the calls. I felt unfaithful to Ted discussing this with a stranger, but saying my thoughts out loud to a person took some of the sting out of them. I wrote Ted, I am a mature, reasonably, person and can accept things as they are if I only know how things honestly are. Of course, what I am talking about is your relationship with Kim Andrews. I don't like the way I throw up my defenses at the slightest possibility that someone is going to tell me something I thought I knew but didn't. It's like being emotionally shell-shocked. So I have a deal to propose. Will you candidly tell me how it is, and whatever else there is to tell about things that might fall out of the sky to shock me? And for my part, I won't bring it up ever again. His answer, Kim Andrews is a loyal and close friend. She has volunteered to do things for me which no one else down here has volunteered to do. If she had replaced you, I would tell you. If I loved her and no longer loved you, I would tell you. But she hasn't, and I don't. I didn't feel a whole lot better. My counselor was pushing me to open up in group therapy, and I finally took the plunge. I told the group I was dying of terminal loneliness, that my boyfriend, who had been my whole life, was in jail, and now I had no one. We talked about the few steps I had taken to put my life back together. They asked about my daily routine. I told them that every day ended the same way. I drank, wrote letters to my boyfriend, and cried a lot. One of the women, who was a recovering alcoholic, suggested that I probably wouldn't cry so much if I didn't drink so much. It had been her experience that she couldn't make any important changes in her life until she had cut out the alcohol, which she said distorted reality for her. I told her that that was exactly what I needed, a reality distorter. But I admitted that I couldn't seem to get drunk enough anymore, no matter how much I drank. It was getting harder and harder to take the edge off. Sometimes I'd drink till I threw up and still wouldn't be drunk. At other times I would have one beer and it was as if I'd been hit between the eyes with a hammer. The hangovers were getting worse. Usually it was the middle of the afternoon before I felt human. I told the counselor that I wasn't ready to quit, but that I would try to slow down. He told me that he didn't think any amount of counseling would help me if I didn't stop drinking. I thought he was overreacting. If I quit drinking, that would just give me more hours to kill in the evening. You're a bright woman, he told me. You're at a turning point. It's up to you to make the right decisions. But I was worn out from making decisions. I wanted someone else to do it for me. When he suggested that I attend an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, I was insulted. I took care of myself. I had a responsible job. I didn't leave my child at home while I ran around to taverns. I wasn't an alcoholic. Without alcohol, my hands shook, my back ached, and my disposition was rotten. When the counselor told me that these were symptoms of alcohol withdrawal, I was shocked. I was totally unprepared for what life without alcohol would be like. I wrote Ted, I have quit drinking, and I have discovered that by drinking, I have only postponed all the hurt, agony, and sorrow. I am feeling these emotions intensely now. It is so painful that the temptation to soften it all with a drink is very strong. I was mad at the counselor for making me quit. I was mad at everyone. The counselor and the two recovering alcoholics in the therapy group were pushing AA at me. They said I'd find people there who were going through the same things I was. Fat chance. There was only one Ted Bundy, and nobody else was dealing with what I was. Whenever I made arrangements to go to an AA meeting with one of the women, something always came up so that I had to cancel. But I wasn't drinking, and as much as I carried on about how miserable I was without booze, every day that went by without a drink was a triumph to me. Eventually, the nagging I got from the group wore me down, and I made contact with them to attend an AA meeting. It was in a random second-story hall in a slightly shabby neighborhood, and as I walked slowly up the stairs, I said to myself, so this is it, the bottom of the barrel. This particular meeting was for women only, and to my surprise, they were all fairly intelligent, clean, happy women about my age. I listened to their stories about their lives when they were drinking as compared to their lives now that they were sober, and I wanted what they had. I could identify with the feelings of guilt and remorse and self-hatred that they talked about. They told me that if I didn't take the first drink, I wouldn't get drunk. I had never thought of it that way, and it seemed like the most profound thing I'd ever heard. They also told me they lived their lives and stayed sober one day at a time. I wonder if that would work for me. I was tired of reliving the past every day. It embarrassed me to tell Ted about going to AA meetings, but I needed his praise and his opinions. He wrote, "You have every right to be proud of your success in stopping drinking. We both know how much alcohol was a part of our lives. Your success is genuine." He cheered me on like a football coach, and I loved him for it. And I tried to support him as well as I could. In our letters, we fantasized about a new life for the three of us, a new life away from fear and worry, perhaps on a small farm or a cabin in the mountains. His letters detailed the 90-day evaluation. Then there was the educational achievement tests. First, there was spelling. "Spell cat," said our lemon-faced school marm, who didn't seem to think any of us could. In another letter, "I received a message today from the University Medical Center. It seems the EEG they did on me last week was inadequate because I was not relaxed. I can't imagine why I wasn't. After all, are handcuffs, chains, and leg irons conducive to relaxation? I tried my best, though. As I lay there in the dark, my eyes closed, I repeated over and over, 'I love her. I love her,' with your picture in my mind. You are with me everywhere I go." It was in every letter. "The only reality I fight to preserve is you. You are my link to everything I hold dear. You keep alive emotions of caring and loving. I love you and Tina." The psychologist gave me a test where pictures are shown and a story was told by me about each picture. The last card was blank, and I was to imagine a picture. It was a picture of you in the kitchen, and as I told it, tears began flowing uncontrollably down my face. "I miss everything about you." Then in May he wrote, "Not to my surprise, the combined results of all of the psychological and medical tests show me to be completely normal, a psychiatrist told me." He kept saying, "Very interesting." He also said that he believes me when I say I didn't do it, but being a loyal employee of the state, he asked me if it was possible I had forgotten it all. They never give up. And in another letter, "They have reached the end of their proverbial rope and are now insinuating that I am very complex and hard to know, which simply means that they have no basis to say that X caused Y kidnapping." The psychiatrist has been the most honest with me. He has said on 2 occasions that he can see nothing to suggest that I was in any way capable of committing such a crime. Both Don Morgan, my probation officer, and Al Carlisle, psychologist, are anxious to talk to you. I suggest you speak to them and be honest with them, but be careful. Morgan, for instance, made reference to the numerous contradictions and statements you made to the King County authorities, something about composite picture similarities. I was not aware of such statements, and I really do not think they are in any way relevant to the evaluation of me as a person. I should clarify something at this point. Nothing you have said has hurt me. Your honest and forceful statement of your opinions about me now, however, can be helpful. I do have confidence in you. Later in May, "This evaluation has reached the final impasse. Stalemate and I lose. He, the psychiatrist, is saying, I don't have enough information to predict your future behavior, which is bullshit. Or, please confess, it would make everything so simple. What he is saying is that he cannot predict future violence. My tests are too good, but he is too much of a coward to forecast peaceful behavior. I think I can pry him off his rock, though." On June 14th, he wrote, "The tension builds each day as sentencing approaches. I am in no way mentally prepared to accept anything the judge imposes, least of all commitment. I am really not as brave as I would like to make myself believe. When I think of years without you, I see an eternity in hell. I need you and my freedom too dearly to accept commitment to prison with no more emotional response than I would have to spoiled milk. There is no denying the life and death significance of next Tuesday. The last letter he wrote to me before he was sentenced was the worst. Time and circumstances have converged. All our lives have been focused on one day. For you and I, it has all come down to this final letter, the last letter you will receive before I am sentenced next Wednesday. At such a time, I am unable to choke back the urge to cry or hold back the tears. It is not that what I have to say is so sad. Rather, it is the realization that I may not be saying it again which makes me emotional. I would like this to be my finest, softest love letter. I wish each word could kiss you. He went on to tell me that I was the woman he loved and had loved exclusively for years, that I had given his life the meaning which gives living beauty and dimension, that I was the woman who made him know what it is to be a man, the lover who had taught him the secret thrills of my sexuality, a mother who showed him the joy and fulfillment of raising a child. I would not change places with any other man in the world. I consider you a miracle in my life, and in spite of the disaster we have suffered, I would not for a moment ever wish for another woman. You are the most loving and lovely woman I have ever known. You are in my mind constantly. No words can express adequately the dimensions of my feelings. I shall love you forever and forever in my dreams. I shall love you with every long-haired beauty I see. I shall love you with every clear blue sky. I will love you till my last breath. There can never be any goodbyes for you and I. No parting because we are always with each other in spirit. No goodbyes. Just I love you. My reaction to this letter was so intense that I scared myself. This was the end that I had been trying to ignore for the last 3 months. I knew Ted would be sentenced to life in prison. What a cruel joke. Life in prison. He would die in there, and I would be responsible for his death. God, how I regretted making those phone calls. I had a list of phone numbers of AA people I could call if I was afraid of taking a drink. I had no desire to drink. I wanted to die, and I didn't know if it would be okay to call them under those circumstances. I didn't know how to ask for help. I pulled myself together enough to make arrangements for Tina to stay with friends, and when I was alone, I threw myself on the floor and against the walls, cursing myself for being alive. I was so hysterical when I picked up the phone and called one of the recovering alcoholic women I knew from group therapy that at first she couldn't understand me, but she listened and offered to come to my house. I didn't want that, and I think I frightened her. She gave me the name of another older woman and made me promise to call her. A part of me was sure that no one wanted to help me because I was loathsome. How could I call on a total stranger for help? I turned angrily to God. "Help me, help me, help me," I demanded. The answer I got was to call the woman. Her name was Pat. She was an oasis of serenity. She listened to me and talked to me about a loving God. She asked me how long I'd been sober, and when I told her it had been about 7 weeks, she said that I couldn't possibly hope to feel together and sane all in that time so soon. After years of anesthetizing our bodies and our brains, she said, we didn't have the ability to handle our emotions like normal people. I didn't want to tell her that I was still wrestling with whether or not I was an alcoholic. We talked for a long while. She became my AA sponsor, and I owe my life to her. Bundy gets 1 to 15 years, the headline read. Convicted kidnapper Theodore R. Bundy of Tacoma was sentenced in Salt Lake City to 1 to 15 years in prison yesterday for the abduction of a young woman in Murray, Utah shopping mall in 1974. District Court Judge Stuart M. Hansen, Jr. passed sentence after Bundy, a former University of Utah and University of Puget Sound law student, made a tearful plea that his incarceration would serve no purpose. Yes, I will be a candidate for rehabilitation, Bundy said in court, but not for what I have done, but what the system has done to me. Bundy's attorney, John D. O'Connell, said he intends to file an appeal to the Utah State Supreme Court immediately. Bundy's fate is now up to the Utah Board of Pardons, which under ordinary circumstances might review a request for parole within 6 months of sentencing. Judge Hansen reduced the charge from a first-degree to a second-degree count. A first-degree charge would have called for a 5 years to life sentence. Hansen said he reduced the charge because there were no other instances of criminal charges of a similar nature against Bundy. Bundy appeared in Hanson's court as his own attorney for part of the proceedings and argued that his 90-day psychiatric evaluation at the Utah State Prison was inaccurate. Bundy objected to the psychiatric evaluation, which described him as having an antisocial personality, harboring passive aggressiveness, being a private person, insecure, hostile, and being unable to handle stress. He just underwent 9 months of the worst stress I've seen, and he handled it better than Mr. Nixon handled Watergate without breaking down, O'Connell said. Bundy also objected to the report's characterization of him as being dependent on women. Who isn't dependent on women? He asked the judge. Bundy, who has spent the last 10 months in jail, told the judge before sentencing, someday, who knows when, 5 to 10 years in the future, when the time comes, when I can leave, I suggest you ask yourself where we are, what's been accomplished, was the sacrifice of my life worth it at all? Chapter 16. September 1st, 1976, exactly 6 months from the day of Ted's conviction, I was on my way to see him at the Utah State Prison. The day was hot and sunny, the kind of summer weather you can count on in Utah. The 90-mile drive from Ogden to Draper gave me time to think. It had been a battle to get to see Ted. The prison rule was that a single male prisoner could have only one unmarried female on his list of people cleared to visit, and Ted already had listed Kim Andrews. The prison officials told Ted that I could not visit him unless he took Kim's name off the list and put mine there in its place. As jealous as I was of Kim, I didn't want her to abandon him. When I got to Utah, I called the warden's office and told the official I talked to how dumb I thought the rule was, but he justified it by saying that prison had a romanticizing effect on relationships that was bad for the prisoners. He told me that with the prison system as the adversary, couples were drawn tightly together. I thought that was ridiculous. Look, I told him, I've known Ted since 1969. I'm going to be in Utah for 1 week. If I lived here and wanted to see Ted every week, I could see your point. 1 week's worth of visits is not going to pit Ted and me together against your system. I was prepared to keep fighting until I got my way. After considerable discussion, he gave in. I was perplexed by the anger that seemed to be always there, just beneath the surface. I had always thought of myself as sweet and nice, but now that I had stopped drinking, I seemed to boil with anger. I kidded myself about being even-tempered, mad all the time. But it was a real problem. My letters to Ted were full of complaints about the way Tina and I were getting along. She was the bright spot in my life, but staying sober and carving out a new life an inch at a time left me exhausted and short-tempered. The person who got the most of my anger was Ted. I wrote him dreadful hot and cold letters that started out by telling him how much I missed him and loved him, and then moved on to the same dead-end issue, his infidelity. I really did love him, but I wanted my revenge too. In a way, it was a relief to feel angry at somebody besides myself. The prison was a huge concrete box baking in the sun off to the right of the freeway. Ted had told me that the temperature inside routinely got up to 102 degrees, just like his old apartment, but now he couldn't go out for a drink to cool off. After he was sentenced, Ted vowed that he would never accept and adapt to prison. His mood was grim, and he complained of insomnia and of feeling abandoned. He was angry at his mom, who talked to him about faith, prayer, salvation, and destiny. He wrote me that he would not feel guilty for things he had not done. I looked up at the guard tower. This really is a prison, I thought. You can't take your purse in, the guard in the lobby barked at me. Back to the car, lock the purse in the trunk, back inside the prison lobby. I need your driver's license, said the guard. Back to the car, get the license, back to the guard. You can't take those keys in, he said. What was I supposed to do with the car keys? Lock them in the car? I asked the guard if he could keep them for me in his little cubicle. He grudgingly agreed. As he filled out the record with my name, I saw Kim Andrews' name and birth date, 1952. In 1952, I was teacher's pet in Miss Wilson's second grade class. The guard told me I would be able to enter the visiting area in about 10 minutes. I took my place against a wall with the other families and friends. I nervously rolled the tassels from my Mexican blouse around my fingers, not wanting to look around. I didn't belong here. The 10-minute wait seemed to last forever. Finally, everybody moved forward into a little holding room. The door by which we had entered was closed electrically, and the door to the visiting room opened. The visitors and prisoners rushed towards each other. I wanted to scream. At first I couldn't see Ted. Then he grabbed my arm and pulled me to him and hugged me tight. He led me to some chairs in a corner, and we sat down facing each other, holding hands, our knees mixed up together. He looked so handsome. He had on jeans and a blue work shirt, and he had a tan from the hours working out at the Draper Racquetball Club, as he put it. He looked just like he used to look when we went off to go rafting. The room was noisy, and there were little kids jumping around. This is not real, I kept telling myself. This is not real. This is not Ted's life. I couldn't speak. He stared at me. "How was your drive?" he finally said. It was such a silly question that we both laughed. Then, between the I love yous and the gee, look greats, we talked nonstop. I told him about Tina. He told me about the friends he had made in prison. We talked about AA. He had been going to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in prison because he was so excited about what I was going through. We talked about the new me and how proud he was of me. He asked me if I had been dating. "Oh, some," I answered, trying to sound nonchalant. I had gone to bed with the first guy I had gone out with. It had been a cold and calculated act. It had felt like revenge when I planned it, but it left me feeling hollow and shaken. It wasn't so easy for me to be irresponsible when I didn't have wine and beer to help. I had learned a lot from the experience, but now Ted was prying it out of me, and it made me angry, as if I were accountable to him for my actions. That led us to a polite argument about Kim, and Ted changed the subject. We began talking about the poetry he had written for me. He was proud of it, and I loved it, but I heard myself saying, "I really wanted to ask you to not write any more poetry to me. I find it just too upsetting. Sometimes I wonder if you send the same poems to other people." The pain in his eyes made me wish I'd never said it. I didn't mean it. I only wanted to hurt him the way he hurt me. "I wrote you those poems because I love you," he said. I pulled my chair up to his so I could put my arms around him. I was sickened by my own anger and the pride that wouldn't let me back down. "I love you," I told him. "I'm sorry that I'm spoiling this time we have together." We held each other for a little while longer, and with my anger out of the way, we could begin to talk more naturally. I asked him to give me a back tickle. "Not here," he said. "Then where?" I asked him. He felt foolish, but he tickled my back for me. We kissed a lot, but it was very restrained. There was no point in getting turned on. We went back to conversation. In the middle of talking about his family, he suddenly said flatly, "I can't live in here. Something's going to happen. Soon." I was horrified. I knew he was talking about escape. His letters had hinted at it. "No," I told him. "It'll only cause more problems." "Every day I'm in here, I'm dying," he said. "I can't live like this." "Don't tell me about it," I said quickly. We began talking about ordinary things again, and soon it was time for me to leave. We both began crying hard. I promised to come back on Sunday before my plane left for Seattle. I wanted him to leave with me now. I was herded into the holding area, but I could see the guards pat him down. He turned around and waved to me. Then he was gone. I collected my keys and stumbled out into the hot sunlight, and I thought that the agony of leaving him would kill me. As I drove out of the parking lot, I saw a bunch of colorful hang gliders coming off the mountain on the other side of the freeway, flying free in sight of the prison. If I ever needed a drink to take away reality, I needed one then, but I thought how disappointed Ted would be if I slipped. When I came to the turnoff for Murray, I left the freeway and pulled into a gas station to get directions to the Fashion Place Mall. When Ted was out on bail, he had let me read a copy of the police report on Carol Durant's abduction. Now I wanted to retrace her steps. I parked behind Sears as she had and walked through the store into the mall. The report had said something about the Walden bookstore. I stopped in front of it. I tried to picture Ted approaching, wearing green slacks and patent leather shoes. No, it didn't compute. I leaned against the building and watched people walk by. There were several young, attractive women shopping by themselves. Would Ted see them as victims? Someone did. If a man came up to me right now and said he was a police officer, what would I do? Would I go with him? If he was as handsome and well-mannered as Ted, I might. The way the phony police officer had led Carol Durant all around the mall made me think that he enjoyed toying with his victims. I shouldn't be doing this, I thought. My face was flushed. I had the kind of headache you get from eating ice cream too fast. I found a phone book and looked up the address of the Salt Lake City Alano Club. Alano clubs are places where recovering alcoholics can go for coffee and company. I wanted to be around something positive. I pulled out of the north side of the mall's parking lot and headed east. I tried to find the school where the man had stopped and slammed the handcuffs on Durant. I could almost see her fighting off her attacker, and I could feel her fear, but I could not see what he looked like. This was stupid to be doing this to myself. I headed for the Alano Club. I talked to a woman at the club for a while, but it didn't help much. I was afraid to go back to my parents' house. I wasn't afraid of the scotch they kept. It was the hunting rifles in the basement. It hadn't been hard for me to see that my drinking had been a slow form of suicide. Now when I flew into a self-destructive rage, it wasn't drinking I thought about, but putting a gun in my mouth and blowing my head off. I called my AA sponsor in Seattle. It was hard for me to ask for help. I told her that I'd been to the prison and that I was a little bit shaky. I was afraid that if I told her how crazy I really was, she wouldn't be my friend anymore. Talking with her gave me the strength to go back to Ogden, but I knew I didn't have the strength to go back to the prison to see Ted again. I knew I should see Ted again because I had told him I would, and he would be counting on it, but I couldn't. I called the prison and asked if they would give him a message. Absolutely not, I was told. I didn't know what else to do, so I sent him a mailgram telling him I would not be there. I felt guilty about putting myself first, but guilty or not, I still wasn't going to go. When I got back to Seattle, there was a letter from Ted waiting for me. Our 2 hours together was without a doubt the most emotionally intense experience of my life. I wouldn't trade the experience for anything in the world, though, unless I was offered my freedom to be with you. The next letter I had from him was an extremely painful one, dated September 7th, 2 days after the Sunday I didn't show up. If I sound bitter, it is, because I am, he wrote. This is not your problem any longer, as you well recognize. Perhaps I am too much of a sentimentalist, but as difficult as it would have been, I would have liked to say goodbye to you in person, kiss you one last time. Sunday, as I sat on the bench in the prison yard, basking in the sun, the fear grew with each hour. What a pathetic creature I must have appeared to be, watching, waiting. Then 3 o'clock arrived, and 3:15, and 3:30, and 3:50, and finally 4. I waited until the bitter end. I imagined you driving to the airport and boarding the plane just a few miles away, and I was struck with the panic of a caged animal. I felt the suicidal urge to run at the barbed wire fence and run to say goodbye to you before the plane flew you away from me forever. Crying, trembling as the last minute ticked away, I kept pleading softly to myself, "Please, Liz, please. Please don't leave me this way." Sunday was the most demoralizing day of my life. Sunday, I think, I finally recognized how powerless and weak I am. Our letters continued. He tried to explain to me the pressures and expectations that build in a prisoner. I was embarrassed by my disregard for what he was going through. I tried to be more sensitive to his needs. Our letters flowed back and forth, and we wrote about how much we loved each other, but with less intensity than before my trip to Utah. In October, a year after he had been arrested and charged with kidnapping, Ted was charged with first-degree murder in Colorado for the death of Karen Campbell, who disappeared from a ski lodge near Aspen on January 12, 1975. In his letter to me, Ted insisted on his innocence. This case they filed is based on information they have had since last February, but the evidence, was manufactured. The prosecution filed a witness list, and on it are the names Carol DeRanch, Jerry Thompson, David Yoakum, and Robert Campbell, King County. It is going to be like a rerun of a bad dream. DeRanch crying, Thompson lying. Yes, I saw 4 pairs of patent leather shoes in his house, and Campbell implying. He's a pretty weird and a suspect in 4,900 disappearances. It's an innuendo case. Damn it, I am not grandstanding, Liz. I am innocent, and they are going to frame their little heads off. Please try to believe in me. I didn't know what to believe. I thought it possible that the police would plant evidence, but on the other hand, damn it, why was Ted in Colorado when he wasn't supposed to be? One of the main pieces of evidence the prosecutor said was a ski brochure Ted was carrying when he walked off the plane to visit me in January 1975. The police said there was a check mark next to the name of a resort called the Wildwood Inn, the place from which Karen Campbell was abducted. Ted had told me that the man sitting next to him on the plane had given it to him. If Ted had killed Karen Campbell 3 days before he came to see me, would he be carrying such a telltale piece of evidence? He wanted to know if I would come to Colorado for the trial. It wasn't easy to tell him that I wouldn't go through another trial. I asked him to understand. He sent me an anguished reply, a poem. Into a raging river you and I were tossed. Separately, we are swept along, trying desperately to save ourselves. I understand survival. I practice it myself. Neither of us has the strength to pull the other to shore. A few days later, Ted was sentenced to 15 days in isolation, the whole, for suspicion of attempting to escape. He told me what happened. On Tuesday afternoon, I was searched, and a friend's Social Security card was found in my pocket. Later that afternoon, while I was resting in my cell on B Block, several officers appeared and began searching my cell. With no further explanation, my things were packed and taken away, and I was escorted to maximum security. I would try to explain more of the story to you, but I'm not sure if these letters are read. It is sufficient to say that I never seriously planned or attempted to escape. The situation is frightfully depressing and distressing, especially in light of the fact that I had recently thoroughly adjusted myself to making the best of prison life in hopes of being released in the shortest period of time. He described the whole as having a steel door, a small window, walls littered with graffiti, a urine and vomit stench, a concrete slab to sleep on, no commissary, no visits, no companionship. I hated more than anything else to be treated as if I was stupid. I fired a letter back to him. It sounds like your current accommodations are a delight. You got more bad press when your plans and current situation hit the front page of both papers, but I guess what really got me was your grandstanding to the omnipotent authorities through your letter to me. The facts, to me, show that you perhaps earned your way into the God-forsaken hole. It makes me sick to think of what you are going through, but I can't plead for you. I get caught up in a way of thinking that I can somehow influence what you do or don't do, or that if I suffer along with you, somehow your suffering will be lessened. But it is too heavy a price to pay. I know your need for support at this time is acute, but I know that I only have a limited supply because I must look out for myself. But in my next letter to him, I was telling him that it was an immense relief to know that you're okay, that my blast, as you call it, didn't blow you away. Confusion reigns supreme. Just know that I love you. 2 steps forward and 1 step back. We filled a need in each other still. The letters flowed back and forth, amusing, comforting, understanding. But most of all, Ted's letters made me feel loved. I knew the words were only words, but they could still make me feel good. Right before Christmas he wrote, "Nowhere in the hundreds of pages of letters I have written to you, I don't believe I ever successfully expressed the totality of what you, Elizabeth, are to me. Lord knows I have strained every brain cell to put your magic on paper. Every molecule in you, all the tones in your voice move me. My whole mind and body are gripped by your invisible power. The life I loved living is you. Laughter is you. Women are you. Sometimes I believe I am you. Memories, music, wind, rain, sleep are you. I am so lonely without life, and life is you." I had never spent Christmas anywhere but home in Utah, and this Christmas was to be no exception. Part of me didn't want to go to the prison to see Ted in a cage, but my heart said go. After the first of the year, he would be taken to Colorado to stand trial, and it would be harder to see him there. Once again, I had to battle the warden's office. Kim Andrews was still the one woman on his visitors list, and they didn't think exceptions should be made, but permission was finally granted and a time set up for my visit. There wasn't much snow on the ground around the prison. It was a bright sunny day, and I'd had my eyes dilated early that morning for my annual eye checkup. Even with my shades on, the sun was painful. As I pulled into the parking lot, I thought about Gary Gilmore inside there somewhere. He had been sentenced to death, and he said that he looked forward to dying. I was appalled that Utah might be the first state to begin executing people again. Ted was in maximum security after his escape attempt, and that was in a different building. I was much calmer checking in than I had been the last time, though my pupils felt like 50-cent pieces, and I wanted to tell the guard that I wasn't on drugs. But he, like everyone else I dealt with at the prison, treated me as if I were some subnormal category of being, as if real people never went to prison and real people never came to visit them. We had the visiting room all to ourselves. Ted was wearing what looked like white pajamas, and he had a mustache. He looked great. The first topic of conversation was my hair. After wearing it long and straight forever, I'd had it cut long but really curly. We hung all over each other. When our 1 hour was up, the guard shouted that it was time to go. Ted groaned and asked if we could have more time. To my surprise, the guard gave us another 15 minutes. There are some nice ones, Ted told me. After much more than 15 minutes, the guard said, "That's it." 5 more minutes, Ted said. "We've got some crying to do." We had cried some as we talked and laughed too, and we cried when we said goodbye. It wasn't the gut-wrenching feeling that had gripped us last summer, but it was still hard. We walked with our arms around each other over to the gate back into the Max. It still amazed me how well our bodies fit together. We embraced and kissed for so long I thought maybe the guard would come with orders to break it up. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. One morning in January, the first thing I heard when my clock radio came on was news that Gary Gilmore had been executed in Utah at the same prison where Ted was held. It was so real that I felt too sick to face the world another day. There had been a time when I didn't pay any attention to news of murders and criminals. Now I seemed to be affected by every murder I read about in the paper. I felt the horror of the victims, the anguish of their families, the sickness of the murderers, the disbelief of the criminals' families and friends. I despaired at what human beings do to other human beings. At the end of January, Ted was moved to Colorado. He complained of the jail conditions, especially after he was moved to Glenwood Springs, because the Aspen jail had been found unfit for long-term prisoners. The one good thing about Glenwood Springs was that he had access to a phone. He called me collect at least once a week, sometimes 2 or 3. I liked talking to him, but I felt weighted down by the calls. I knew the satisfying way we connected robbed me of the motivation to get out in the world and make some real friendships with people who were part of my day-to-day life. March 1st was the anniversary of the date Ted was convicted. It seemed as if there had never been a time when he hadn't been in trouble. In April, I celebrated my first year of sobriety with another day of profound depression. I burst into tears when called on to speak at my AA meeting. In May, on Mother's Day, my car was stolen from in front of my house. The next day, the police found it on a school playground. That same afternoon, I got a call from my high school sweetheart, Ben. When I went away to college, I jilted him, not once, but several times. I would call him up and ask him to come back and then drop him again. He was such a funny, kind, ambitious guy. The instant I heard his voice, I knew he had come to take me away from the chaos, back into the simple life of high school in 1962. He had married, he said, had kids, and was now divorced. He was in Seattle on business. We got together and had a fine time hashing over old times. We made tentative plans for me to visit him in San Francisco when Tina was visiting her dad in the summer. I was happy about the whole thing, pleased that when Ted called I was able to keep it from him. I talked to Ted so often and for so long that there wasn't anything he didn't know about my life. I didn't want him to know about Ben because then he would barrage me with letters about being in the arms of another, etc., and I wanted to be free to do whatever I liked. Just about the time that Ben was due back in Seattle, Ted jumped out of a courtroom window in Aspen and escaped. He was recaptured after 6 days, during which time I worried that he would contact me and ask for help. Knowing that I would have no choice but to turn him in, I prayed that he would never put me in that position. Back in prison, he called a few days later. He didn't want to talk about the escape other than to joke about falling out of a window and wandering around senseless in the Rocky Mountains. I told him as gently as I could that I was involved with someone. I didn't want him to hurt, but I wanted to go my own way. He wrote to me, "While I cannot now or ever be able to fully comprehend or accept the reality of you loving, touching, laughing with, and caring for another man, I know now that such an inevitability must be dealt with on the kind of understanding level which knows your happiness is my ultimate concern. So I understand." Shortly after that, Ben told me that I had too many problems for him, and he dropped me. Ted continued to call, and as usual, it was Ted I turned to for understanding and support when I hurt. I told him that the someone was my high school boyfriend, and he laughed. He told me some more about what happened when he hooked up with his old flame, Susan Phillips. Old lovers, he wrote, are often vehicles to the serene, uncomplicated, long-ago dream world of lost youth, and like old used cars, old lovers too often have too many miles on them to make the trip back. I bought a new house, got a promotion at work, and no longer hated myself every minute of every day. After I moved into my new house, Angie came for a visit. She had moved back to Utah. She had been going through some rough times herself, and as we talked, we realized how much we meant to each other. We carefully avoided any mention of Ted, but we fell into a long conversation about life and what it was all about. I was able to share with her the things I had learned in AA, but my pride wouldn't let me tell her where these ideas came from or that I was in AA. One of the steps to sobriety is making amends to those you have hurt. For a long time, I denied that I needed to make amends to anyone. The only person I had hurt with my drinking was myself. But being face to face with Angie and telling her I was sorry for the way things had worked out was a tremendous relief. When she went back to Ogden, we ran up big phone bills getting to know each other again. Since Ted had been in prison, we had developed a Share the Book program where we read the same book at the same time and shared our views and ideas. We were reading Shogun, a love story. In one letter, Ted quoted a passage describing the hero after his lover had been killed. Many times, Blackthorn had looked over his shoulder expecting her to be there, but she was never there and never would be, and this did not disturb him. She was with him forever, and he knew he would love her in the good times and the tragic times, even in the winter of his life. She was always on the edge of his dreams, and now those dreams were good, very good. And he added his own words, "I feel you there, looking over my shoulder, a very powerful force in my life. Even though it is winter in my life, I still need you. I still love you." I felt the same way about him. He was always there, looking over my shoulder. I didn't want to stop loving him or erase the power of his love from my life, but I needed real in-the-flesh relationships. So it was back to therapy. The therapist gave me a questionnaire to fill out and another one to give to a person who knew me well. I sent it to Ted. After I turned them in to be scored, the therapist told me I had scored in the 98th percentile, meaning that if I was in a room with 100 people, there would be only one person in the room who was more depressed than me. One day, Ted called me at work and was talking about a friend who had been to see him. I asked him who the friend was, and he hemmed and hawed but told me it was some guy he had met in Salt Lake City, but I knew he was lying. A woman named Boone had been to see him. I didn't know who she was, and I didn't care. He wrote to me a long, mournful letter. I was shocked to be confronted with my old self today, my old, petty, deceiving self. I was embarrassed, too. It is a humiliating experience to be confronted with a weakness I thought I had corrected. It is a frightening thought to think that I am unable to correct it. He wrote about death. I am not sure I have the courage for that yet. My instinct to survive is strong. Although that instinct seems so pathetic and pointless right now, what for? Who for? I bring pain to you. I bring pain to others who care for me, and I bring pain to myself. It is time to rethink this awful experience, because the stimulus of standing alone in the face of great odds is not satisfying anymore. It is time to reevaluate the value of living without being alive. The crazy flow of things seems to have stopped. I want to look around me now. I want to master life and death. Shortly before Christmas, Ted's motion for a change of venue was granted. The trial would be held in Colorado Springs, the prosecutor's hometown and probably the most conservative place in Colorado. Juries there routinely sentence people to death. Ted was beside himself. Shortly after this, Colorado's death penalty was found to be unconstitutional, so that burden was off his mind. He still couldn't believe that he was to be tried in Colorado Springs. The prosecutor, Milton Blakely, had been loaned to Aspen to prosecute Ted, and now a judge had moved the trial back to Blakely's hometown. Before I left to go to Utah for Christmas, I got a letter from Ted saying there could be no goodbyes, and that whatever happened, he wanted to make sure that I knew he loved me, and that my memory was with him always. It was the same kind of letter he had been sending me for the past year and a half, and I was resigned to the fact that our relationship would never end. While I was in Utah, he called me at my parents' house. "It just makes more trouble for me," I complained. He explained that he only wanted to hear my voice one more time. "How many times have we gone through this?" I laughed. He wasn't laughing. He was dead serious. I was back in Seattle on the afternoon of New Year's Eve when Detective Campbell called about 1 o'clock. "Ted's gone," he said. "He's got an 8-hour jump. No one knows where he is."